Welcome to Acton Line, the podcast of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Caroline Roberts, producer and host. By the time this episode is released, Christmas will be right around the corner. If you celebrate Christmas like I do with my family, you probably gather around the tree to open gifts on Christmas morning, or you decorate cookies together, and maybe you also attend a church service or mass. But in communist China, there's a different tradition. During Christmastime in 2015, 1,700 churches were torn down or vandalized in China, a result of the Chinese government growing increasingly hostile to Christianity. Similar events took place last year as well, with the New York Times reporting that Early Rain Covenant Church had been shut down and members were forced to find somewhere else to celebrate Christmas. From reports of prison labor camps in the country to growing surveillance through technology, China is increasingly cracking down on freedom. This is all laid out in a new book from Encounter Books, titled Deceiving the Sky, Inside Communist China's Drive for Global Supremacy. The author, Bill Gertz, joins us on Acton Line today to discuss. He's a national security columnist for The Washington Times and a senior editor of the Washington Free Beacon. Don't forget that every week I put together a list of articles and resources in our show notes that I think you would really like, and you can check those out at blog.acton.org. That's blog.acton.org. Also, because of the holiday, our podcast team is taking a little bit of time off, but we will be back with an episode in the new year on January 8th. If you are on the road at all this week, I also hope you have safe travels and a very Merry Christmas.
Welcome to Acton Line. I'm your host, John Caritas. Today we welcome to the podcast Bill Gertz. He's the national security correspondent for the Washington Times. He has a new book out from Encounter. It's titled Deceiving the Sky, Inside Communist China's Drive for Global Supremacy. Welcome to the podcast, Bill.
Hi, good to be on the program.
You know, we're recording this segment on December 18th. We're only a week out from Christmas. So before we get into some of the more specifics on the economic, the tech, the military threat that you've laid out in this book, can we talk a little bit about religious freedom in China? I think that would be appropriate. You cite that in your book. And at this time of year in China, there's a Christmas tradition. It's not about singing Christmas carols and setting up the tree. In communist China, it's about bulldozing churches, raiding church services, following around pastors with mass surveillance, and ticking off boxes on their social credit scores. What is it about Christianity and other religions that so freaks out the Communist Party in China? What is the threat that they fear?
Yes, well, it's an amazing thing. For many years, probably for the last 10 to 15 years, there's been a tacit accommodation by the Chinese government of unofficial Christian churches in China. As you know, there are millions, tens of millions of believers in China, and they've managed to do pretty well. And China has played a very sophisticated influence game, which was designed to allow these unofficial churches to operate. And then, as you mentioned, around Christmas time each year, they would select a few of these home churches and bulldoze them and arrest the pastors in a very brutal and message-sending way.
Make an example of them, right?
Yeah, and that policy is changing under the current dictator, Xi Jinping, and he has assumed powers that we haven't seen in this system since Mao Zedong, who's been identified as perhaps the world's largest mass murderer through his operations in China to kill millions of Chinese. And now we have Xi Jinping. He is into utter control. And by that I mean the Communist Party of China is this, I say totalitarian. Many people say it's authoritarian, but its activities fit all the definitions of a totalitarian state: complete control, lack of freedom. They do permit some liberty in terms of economic development, but in terms of anything related to the Communist Party, they are taking much stronger measures than they have in the past, and this includes a crackdown on religious groups, especially Christians. And again, they have been doing such things as forcing churches, the official churches, to replace biblical scripture with the sayings of Xi Jinping in the churches themselves.
So deifying their totalitarian leader, in other words.
Yes, yeah. And so this is a real threat. And again, a lot of the groups that operated in China unofficially were very cautious against speaking out, and they still are somewhat cautious in speaking out against this. And I hope that changes. I hope they begin to speak out much more forcefully and louder against the atrocities being committed by the regime.
Is it simply the fact that we've seen this under other communist regimes? The Communist Party, the state, must be worshipped as a deity, and there can be no challengers to that. There can be no alternative form of allegiance. And Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, all the other faiths pose a risk in that way. Would that be part of it?
Yes, it's clearly a challenge to the power. In fact, many of the China specialists that I know, they've often compared the Communist Party rule as a quasi-religion.
Really?
In other words, it has its own priesthoods, it has its own canon and doctrine, and anybody that challenges that, and of course Christianity and other religions do challenge that. Marxism-Leninism is officially atheist. That hasn't changed. Now they've kind of insinuated some ancient Chinese nationalism and Chinese culture into their official ideology, which is officially still atheist. But they do regard religion as a challenge to the domination, ideological domination by the Communist Party.
Tell us a little bit about Xi Jinping. He's recently become, whatever his title is, he's recently become president for life. He has assumed near total power. You describe him as a ruthless leader. He also has some curious role models that he admires: Hitler, Stalin, and Mao Zedong. What does this tell us about the man?
Xi Jinping has several people that he admires and several people that he despises. And the people he admires are Hitler. I'm told that people who have known him have said that he has statues of Hitler, that he has Nazi uniforms. And the reason that Xi Jinping admires Hitler is because Hitler came very close to taking over the world. And this is, again, a key theme of my book, Deceiving the Sky, how China's trying to dominate and achieve global supremacy. Another figure that he admires is Stalin. And the reason that he admires Stalin is that Stalin was able to control the Red Army and the military through a ruthless series of purges. And again, this is a tactic that is being used by Xi Jinping. And the third person Xi Jinping admires is Mao Zedong, again, because he was ruthless as a dictator and was able to take control of the country and create a personality cult. So those are the three models for him.
And he hates whom? Whom does he hate?
And the people he doesn't like are Ronald Reagan, because Reagan was instrumental in bringing down the Soviet Union, which had a extremely negative impact for the Chinese Communist Party. It forced the Communist Party to undertake its reform and opening up program, which was the product of Deng Xiaoping, who is the person that Xi Jinping despises the most of all, along with Ronald Reagan.
Now, Hitler, of course, was the architect of the final solution, the Holocaust against the Jews. We have a situation in China now where there are camps where the Uyghurs, the Muslim minorities, are being persecuted and put in these camps. Stalin was, of course, the creator of the Gulag system, and so there's a Uyghur Gulag, there's that kind of state there. But what China's advantage is here in the 21st century is that they have tools at their disposal that Stalin never dreamed of: the surveillance state, the internet, all these facial recognition, all these technologies that he's applying. And so I think that in some respects, the picture you paint is much more disturbing than some of the precedents that Xi Jinping is admiring. Let's look at the title of your book. Why did you use that phrase? And I understand from reading the book, it comes out of Chinese folklore, a fable. Explain the title, Deceiving the Sky, and why that's apt for your book. And I want to just mention quickly, this is the second book on the threat of Chinese communism you've written in 20 years. So you're not new to this subject.
Right. Yeah, in fact, by way of background, in the year 2000, I published a book called The China Threat, and that the title was a play on what the communist government in China calls the China threat theory. So I was basically saying there's no theory here. This is a real threat, and I outlined that threat as it manifested back in 2000, which was, again, technology theft, military buildup, threat to Taiwan. And after I wrote that book, interestingly enough, every single publisher, and I did 6 other books after that, told me that they would not publish a single topic China book like the China threat. They said you can have chapters in there, but you can't have a single topic. They didn't explain why. I think it was they feared that it wouldn't sell. And the reason it wouldn't sell is because China can influence our market here, and they're very effective at it. They've got a massive influence campaign that, they buy up officials and lobbyists.
Yeah, we'll talk about that too in a bit, but that you really outline how that works. Even in capital markets, it's incredible. Yeah.
Deceiving the Sky, my original title for it was The China Threat 2.0, and the publisher didn't like that. So we went with Deceiving the Sky. And I like the title because it is based on ancient Chinese strategy, and the Chinese are steeped in strategy. Again, their ideology is Marxism-Leninism with Chinese characteristics, and the Chinese characteristics are this idea of an ancient China being the middle kingdom, that is, the supreme place between heaven and earth. And so they see that they're using their communist ideology to restore this idea that China will be the global supreme power. And a lot of their strategy goes back to what's known as the Warring States era, which was a period about 300 to 200 BC. And many people are familiar with the Chinese strategist Sun Tzu, who, again,
Art of War.
His thing was the Art of War said basically the acme of skill is defeating your enemy without firing a shot. Well, there's another book called The 36 Strategies, which again is one of the really deep canons for the Chinese leadership to follow. And it's essentially how does a weaker power defeat a stronger one? And of course, for the Chinese, that's the United States. Everybody talks about China's rise, but the real reason behind that, in addition to their rise, is that they have to bring about the demise of the United States, which they're doing. So, Deceiving the Sky, it's the first of the 36 strategy, and it says, deceive the sky to cross the ocean. And it's based on a fable back in the Warring States era where a general was trying to get the emperor to go to war with a neighboring province, and the emperor was reluctant. So the general had to fool the emperor or deceive the emperor into going to war. And the way he did that was he invited the emperor to dinner at the home of a wealthy peasant. When the emperor stepped into the peasant's house, he felt the house move, and lo and behold, the house was actually a boat, and this was part of an invasion force that was heading for the neighboring province. And at this point, the emperor had to decide, do I go to war or do I go back? And he decided to go to war. And so therefore, this is the notion for Chinese strategists is that you have to be willing to even deceive the emperor, who in Chinese culture is considered God or the sky. And so you have to even deceive the emperor. And I believe this aptly describes what exactly is taking place today in China, that the Chinese are working to defeat and ultimately destroy the United States in their march for global supremacy.
And the parable looks at their techniques, their strategy, deception, fakery, lies, disinformation, the whole toolkit.
Very steeped in deception. In order to understand the Chinese, you have to understand deception. In our culture, deception is definitely not a virtue. It's something that's avoided, and
it's shameful.
We tend to take people at their word. In China, it's just the opposite. They use deception as a weapon, and in all that they do, whether it's business, diplomacy, intelligence operations, military operations.
In fact, you have an entire chapter titled "How Communists Lie," and in there you quote a fellow by the name of Guo Wengui, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and he's a Chinese billionaire now in exile, and you quote him as saying, "China is a communist country. Communism was building a utopia, but that is fake. That is false. Basically, communists are professional liars. They are telling lies. If you believe them, they will never realize what they promise. They cannot do that. It's impossible." People are aware of what's happening in China, including the Chinese. Repression is so strong that you actually have to leave China to speak your mind. Is that what kind of situation we're facing there today?
Yes, it's very much so. In fact, I was in China in the summer of 2018. I traveled there with then Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, and it was an amazing trip. We were only there for a couple of days, but I really felt like here we are in 2019. We're at the early stages or the middle stages of an information age revolution, where information is ubiquitous. We're on our handhelds for everything from food recipes to driving directions to communications. And yet in China, it was like an information desert. It's tightly controlled. You can't get Google or
Internet shut down
Facebook.
In places, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and they are achieving kind of what I call high-tech totalitarianism. They are really doing it. I remember back in the 90s, the Clinton administration did this unfettered engagement policy, and they said, let's give them all the Internet technology. Nobody can control the Internet. Clinton said that trying to control the Internet will be like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. Well, the Chinese are pretty close to nailing Jell-O to the wall in terms of their ability to control their population through technology. I recently did a piece in the Washington Times on their social credit system, and it's about this massive surveillance system of hundreds of millions of cameras linked together with massive databases and artificial intelligence and high-speed computers that can spot people on the street, take an image of their face, sift it through their database, and identify that person and whether they are wanted by the police, whether they have engaged in dissident activities. It's truly kind of the 1984 totalitarian state that George Orwell outlined.
And continual refinements. They can even identify someone by their gait, how they walk down the street, I understand.
Yes, so that even if, say, someone was able to disguise their face or cover their face, there are other means that they can use to identify people. It is kind of frightening. And just interestingly enough, I did this piece last week on the social credit system, and the New York Times today kind of followed it up today and talked about the massive surveillance state that China is building and exporting. They're not just using it domestically, they're using it as part of their Belt and Road Initiative, which is kind of a Trojan horse of a way to expand their power and influence through economics and trade.
Now, you talk about the unfettered engagement in the Clinton administration, but you also talk in the book, which is a really absorbing account of where we are with China today and in many ways disturbing. But in the book, you go into the history here, and you say that you use the word appeasement, and that from 1975 until about 2017, that the U.S. policies were basically, my description here, naive and not engaging the reality of what China has become. And so this was almost, this was decades of this type of engagement, and everything changed in 2017. And talk about when Donald Trump took office, what changed, how did he change it, and where are we today?
Yeah, sure. Before I do that, let me step back into, as you mentioned, this unfettered engagement policy. I call it a 40-year gamble. And the gamble was based on the notion that, and these were not just strategies, this was actual concrete policies of the United States government. We will engage China, we will be friendly to China, we will look the other way on China's nefarious activities, whether it's human rights abuses or selling missiles and nuclear materials to Pakistan and North Korea, all be under the assumption that this trade was going to have this magic effect of turning this nuclear-armed communist dictatorship into a friendly, pro-Western, moderate government. It was an utter failure.
Democrat and Republican, administration after administration.
Both. Yes, it was done both. And again, now under President Trump, we're making a major shift. And it is, like I say, I've covered this issue for probably 30 years. And Trump is kind of approaching the problem from an economic standpoint, but that standpoint has repercussions for all of these other areas, so whether it's law enforcement, military, diplomatic. So he's using the trade issue basically to say, if we're going to have a relationship with China, it's going to be based on fair and free trade, and it's going to be not based on attacking our economic system and stealing our economic prosperity and value.
It's not just about how many tariffs we're putting on them. There's much more going on there.
Right, and it's similar to what Reagan did with the Soviet Union back in the 80s. He recognized that this monolithic empire, the Soviet Empire, could not really survive without Western technology. So one of the things he did was to cut off as much as possible U.S. technology to the Soviet Union. The Europeans went along with it a little bit, but Reagan told them, look, you're either with us or you're with Moscow, and they kind of fell in line. But and that really brought about the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think Trump is applying the same strategy to China. They've stolen, by the White House reports in the last couple of years said that China has stolen between $250 billion and $600 billion annually in American intellectual property and technology.
It's incredible.
No nation can survive with that kind of loss.
You describe it as the largest theft of wealth in American history?
Yeah. And it was kept secret for years until Trump revealed it. So he's going to say, okay, let's see if this Chinese miracle can survive without their stealing our best secrets and our best information. It's going to be, I'm not sure it's going to work, but I mean, they may have stolen so much that they can now self-generate or possibly innovate. Their real problem is they can't really innovate. They can copy, but they can't really come up with the kind of technologies and new technologies that are being produced in our Silicon Valley, which is really kind of the engine of our economy right now.
Now, back in this period, you heard the sentiment that we just need to trade with China, improve our economic relations. The Chinese will get richer, they'll get more stuff. Gradually, they'll move towards more democratic political structures. In free market circles, you'd hear things like, well, when goods don't cross borders, soldiers will, that sort of thing. But that's not how it worked out with our trade with China, is it?
No. In fact, like I said, China's on the move. Under Deng Xiaoping, their approach was described as bide our time, build our capabilities. They're not biding their time anymore. They're still building their capabilities, but they're expanding. And again, I mentioned they're expanding through this Belt and Road Initiative where they're literally buying up countries, and they use predatory financial and economic policies. For example, they'll go in to an underdeveloped country and tell the government there, look, we like to build a railroad for you, and we'll even finance it for you. And then they impose exorbitant financial terms so that the nation can't pay that, and they say, look, we can't pay you back on this, and then the Chinese say, well, that's our railroad now. And so they're literally, in that way, they're kind of buying up underdeveloped countries. I think their strategy is to use this to buy up the countries surrounding the United States and ultimately to encircle the United States and try to destroy the United States.
You also talk about another disturbing development, and that is Chinese entities entering U.S. capital markets to fund projects, including military projects. So they have free access to U.S. capital markets. They can raise money, but you also talk about how they might be raising money to build aircraft carriers from U.S. capital markets. So those people who have 401ks and mutual funds might be contributing towards this economic warfare that China is exercising. What's the end game for China in U.S. capital markets?
Well, this is a really important part of Deceiving the Sky, and it's based on one of the real heroes is a guy named Roger Robinson, and he's the guy that has identified this financial warfare mechanism of the Chinese government to try to penetrate our relatively unregulated capital markets. So in other words, pension funds and can allow foreign investors, including companies that are under sanctions, whether it's in Russia or China, and they're getting around all of these tariffs that right now is kind of the central feature of the U.S.-China trade war. And so Roger Robinson, like I said, he was one of the heroes of the Reagan administration. He helped bring down the Soviet Union through financial means with Reagan and Bill Clark, the White House National Security Advisor. He's now focused on trying to do a similar thing with China by identifying these financial warfare operations of the Chinese. And he's making good progress. Senator Marco Rubio has introduced legislation in Florida, at least, to force pension funds to basically divest from Chinese companies that are engaged in military activities like building aircraft carriers, which Roger Robinson has identified. And hopefully they'll bring that more nationwide, and then eventually they'll get Congress to pass some regulations. Now, the financial community is opposing this. They're saying that you're going after and undermining free trade. But I think that looking closely and through books like mine, The Deceiving the Sky, it will help educate people to understand this is an existential threat to the United States, the problem of communist China. It's not global warming. It's not the Russians, although that is a significant threat. It is the threat posed by China. They do not wish us well, and they are working actively to undermine and subvert the country, whether it's through economic means or whether it's through exporting fentanyl to kill tens of thousands of Americans as part of the opioid crisis.
Now, you say explicitly, China is not an adversary, it's an enemy, and we need to deal with them on those terms. You said, I want to go back to what you said earlier about technology theft. There's a big issue, a big controversy now in the West about whether to use Huawei 5G technology. Some people, including yourself, if I'm not mistaken, view that Huawei technology as a Trojan horse. It will be used against us in very dangerous ways. So there's a debate going on in the United States and in the UK. I watched Sky News a couple of days ago, and a Chinese Huawei executive came on the show to explain at great length why there's no threat from Huawei. We're trying to create jobs. We're trying to bring advanced technology. And all I could think about was the title of your book. He said this with a straight face, and he went on and on and on. So you say that Huawei is actually connected to the Chinese military. Describe the threat from Huawei's 5G technology for us.
I will say that the U.S. government is solidly behind my view that Huawei is basically a stalking horse for the Chinese government. And again, it fits into this overall use of economic power to gain international supremacy. And so Huawei Technologies is the largest telecommunications company in the world. And the reason it's the largest is because it's been subsidized by the Chinese government. And there are very few competitors who can compete with that are not state companies like that. And so the U.S. government has recognized the threat. Just last month, the Federal Communications Commission, for the first time, banned the use of Huawei technology equipment in a lot of our rural American networks, including some that, like in Wyoming, are right next to our nuclear missile bases. And they end up using Huawei equipment because it's cheaper. And,
I'm sure that's a coincidence, Bill.
Yeah, everybody says, oh, it's 40% cheaper. But what they really don't understand is that this equipment comes with the back door into the Chinese intelligence services. China has an intelligence law that requires companies like Huawei, we can argue whether it's state-owned or not or private. The fact is they are close to the Chinese military. They are literally an arm of the Chinese intelligence service when it comes to the ability to collect and use data, private data. And so the Trump administration is making the case to the Europeans, look, you may not agree with us about Huawei, but what about your people's private data? It's going to be compromised by using this Huawei equipment. And the message is beginning to resonate, and it's beginning to get out there.
We're running short of time, Bill, so I want to wrap up with a question. Do you get pushback from some people? You know, we've got a whole establishment and diplomats, military intelligence, security agencies. Do they say you're basically overcooking this whole issue, that it's not as bad as you say? Do they say that you're causing a problem here? What kind of reaction we get from those? What kind of reaction are you getting?
The opposition to my view comes from two places. One, the Chinese government, which again, their goal and motive is to discredit anyone, not just me, but anyone that opposes their agenda. And they have a lot of supporters in the United States. We used to call them panda huggers. That is, people that have been, if not in the literal pay of the Chinese government, they're ideological fellow travelers who somehow view the Chinese communist system as the path of the future. And again, this is one of the problems of our system, is that, you know, one of the few places in the world where you can find a lot of Marxists is on the American college campuses, and they are dominating the intellectual debate. So they're trying to discredit anyone that challenges their views. You know, I'm an old Cold Warrior. I cut my teeth as a journalist battling the Soviet ideology and activities. And I see the Chinese today as a new Cold War. I mean, problem is for many years, only one side has been waging it, and that's the Chinese. Now, under Trump, they're starting to fight back, and I'm really encouraged that eventually we can convince the Chinese and other people of the world that this communist system is not going to be around much longer.
And your wish is that not only would this threat be met with equal conviction, but that the Chinese people would be liberated.
Yes, absolutely. And you know, I just interviewed the Secretary of State today about this, and I asked him about a speech he gave where he said he distinguished clearly between the Communist Party of China and the Chinese people. And he said the Chinese people do not want a communist system. They've seen what it's like in the United States. They've seen what a free and open system is and can do. And they don't want a system of repression, of support for rogue nations and terrorists. And they want a free and open system. And I think that it's time that we recognize that and start supporting the democratic forces in and around China for real democratic change.
Bill, thanks for coming on Acton Line today.
Thank you very much for having me.
As always, thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I have had so much fun producing this podcast for you in 2019, and I look forward to continuing to produce this podcast for you in 2020. Together, we will explore new topics and hear from new guests and read some more books along the way. If you ever want to reach out to me or anyone else on the podcast team here, You can contact us at Acton Line at acton.org. That's Acton Line, ACTONLINE at acton.org. If you like this episode, don't forget to leave us a rating and review on the Apple Podcast app. This episode of Acton Line was edited by me, Caroline Roberts, with audio mixing by Doug Nagel.